Okay, so before we start the tutorial, there's a couple of things I just want to take a look at. The first of these being the version that I'm running, and now I'm actually using the latest release, which is release 11. If we come to the help menu and choose info, you can see here in the bottom left I'm using 11.026. This is the latest update that is available using your online updater, also available in the help menu. Check for updates, or you can download it from the Maxon website. Most of the things that are being covered will also be doable in earlier versions from release 10 upwards. So if you're only using version 10, then you should be fine. There will be a couple of differences, and hopefully I'll point those out as we go. So other than the version, the other thing that I wanted to discuss was layouts. I'm going to use a slightly modified layout. This layout that we can see here is pretty much the standard layout. Now I use a custom layout, and what I've done is I've made a slightly altered version of this for the MotionWorks tutorial, and I will supply that to you, and that will be in the goodies folder on the file that you download. So just open that up, and then I'll show you how you can load and save that layout into Cinema 4D. To open the layout supplied, just double click it. It will be called motionworks.l4d, which is the standard file name for a Cinema 4D layout. When you double click that, the layout in Cinema will change, and it should look very similar to this layout that I have just switched to now. Once you've opened that up, you may want to resize it to fit your screen, and then you possibly want to save it for future use. So to save the layout, you come to the window menu and you choose layout. As you can see, mine is off the edge of the capture area, so I'm just going to select this top part here, and this will be the menu that you can see. You can come down and choose Save Layout As. When you click that, the window will open up and it will automatically take you to the correct directory. Although this will depend on the version of Cinema that you're using. I believe that they added this feature slightly later on. So, there are two places that you can save your layout depending on the version that you're using. The first place that you can save it is actually in the Applications folder. So on a Mac, it would look something like this. You'll have your Cinema 4D folder with your application, then you'll have a library folder, layout, and in there you can save your layout. So when you choose Window Layout, Save Layout, navigate to this directory and save it in there. The alternative place, in more recent versions, is deep in your user folder. So on a Mac, that is your username, library, preferences, Maxon, your Cinema 4D folder, which may have a slightly different name to this, and again, library, layout, and you can save it in here. Now you might not remember that path to get to that directory, so an easy way to find that is to come into your application, come down to Preferences. If you switch to the Common tab, at the bottom here it says your preferences are stored here, open folder. You can click open that folder, and then you have immediate access to all your preferences. So that's the quickest way to get there. So you can just manually drag the layout file into that folder, or you can choose the option from Window Layout, Save Layout As. Okay, so while we're looking at layouts, just look at a few more options. First of all, once you've saved a layout, you're going to want to reload that. So you can do that with this little pop-up list here. You choose the layout and it loads it in. With the layout, it's pretty flexible. You can move managers around. If we open up a new manager, say Structure Manager, we can then drag this. You can see we get the white line. We can then drop that into the interface as well. Let's just click here and undock that for now. Another thing you can do is you can make tabs. Here the Object Manager is set up as a tab. We can then drag our Structure Manager onto that tab, let go, and we can then tab managers behind each other. You can have more than one Object Manager, more than one Attribute Manager, more than one timeline. So for instance, if we wanted to add a few Attribute Managers here, first of all let's click Make Tab, then click over here to open a new Attribute Manager. When you open a new manager, they do come up locked, so just click here to unlock it, and again we can just drag this down and drop it on, and then we have two tabbed managers. Notice that this is called Attributes Tools. We can click on it, choose Rename, call it Tim's Manager, So you can create specific managers for specific purposes. You change the mode in here depending on what you would like that manager to cover. Okay, I'm just going to undock this and close that. The last thing that I'm going to show you with layouts is to create palettes and things like this. As you can see along the top, we have a toolbar full of icons, and the same down the side. Now a lot of the functions and commands in here have little icons by them, as you can see, and we can create our own palettes and drop them in, so we can essentially create our own layouts and our own interface depending on the kind of workflow that we like to use. Now you access all the commands in what's called the command manager, and you can access that through window layout, and that's in there. Alternatively, you can press Shift F12. So the command manager pops up, and in the command manager we can type in any of the commands that we'd like to use. For instance, extrude, and these are all the different extrude commands that are in the program. If we then click Edit Palettes, we can then drop an icon into the interface, uncheck Edit Palettes, and we now have that icon in our interface. If we then save the layout, that will be there permanently. So if I click that, that adds the Extrude NURBS object. If we right click on the palettes, we can choose Edit Palettes, which is a quick way of accessing this, and to remove an icon, just double click it. If we just switch that off for a moment, you can notice that some of these palettes have words and text and pop out with lots of items in them. Some of them are just single icons. So how do we go about making one of these? Well, it's actually pretty simple and pretty quick, unless you want to make a custom one. For instance, imagine we want to make one from the MoGraph menu and dock that into our interface. First of all, you can click on this bar along the top. That will then create a floating palette of that menu. So that's quite handy in itself. So if you're accessing them but don't want it in your interface, you can just have a little floating palette, and when you finish, click here to close it. So if we want to make this kind of a pop-up palette with icons, first of all we can just click on here and we can switch text off. We can then click and we can choose the number of rows and columns. So let's say 5 rows and columns. We can also choose transpose, which will flip it round. If we choose Edit Palettes, we can remove any items that we don't want. If we're happy with this, let's just switch off Edit Palettes. Okay, so if we want to drop this into our interface, at the moment it's one big palette, so we can choose Fold Palette. So now we have this as a little pop-up list. If we now choose Edit Palettes, drop this MoGraph into here, uncheck Edit Palettes, and now I have the list of all those MoGraph elements in my interface. So if I want to keep that there, remember to choose Window Layout, Save Layout As, and you've got that in your interface. You can spend hours and hours creating custom interfaces, and it's certainly a good idea to improve it as you go. So hopefully that was useful for you. So go and load the interface and the layout that I've supplied, or by all means make your own. I hope you have fun doing it. I'm just going to reset this back to the one that we'll be working with, and now we've done that, we can actually get on and start the tutorial. Okay, so this is where the fun really starts, and this is where we actually start building the project. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to build the globe, and to do this, what we're essentially going to do is take a sphere object and also a cylinder, and then we're going to use the cloner to clone the cylinder across the surface of the sphere. Once we have that in place, we're going to then take an image of the world, and that combined with the shader effector, we will use that to scale down the cylinders so that the clones are only visible where we want them to be, and this will be defined by the texture. Firstly, I'm going to add a sphere object, and I'm going to call this sphere to clone onto. Bit of an obvious name, but it's a good idea to name all your objects as you work on a project. I'm going to set the radius of the sphere to be 400 units. Okay, for now I'm just going to disable the sphere by clicking on the green tick, and the next thing I'm going to do is add in a cylinder. As I said, we're going to clone this cylinder across the surface of the sphere, so we just need to adjust the sizes of each object. Now, one thing to bear in mind when working on any 3D scene, regardless of application, is the polygon count for the overall scene. As you can see from this cylinder, at the moment we have 36 rotation segments. We only have one height segment, which is good. It may default to more. I've set mine up to work like this. And also you may have more cap segments. As we're going to take this cylinder, clone it onto our sphere hundreds of times, we're essentially going to create thousands and thousands of polygons for the scene. So it's a good idea to optimize as you go so that you don't run into trouble later. So for our cylinder, first of all, let's make sure our caps are set to one segment. Let's come back to the Object tab. I'm going to set the radius to be 2.5 and the height to be 8. I only want one height segment, and for rotation segments I'm going to lower that to 6. So rather than 36 rotation segments, we only have 6. So when we have hundreds of these, you can see the difference that that's going to make to the total polygon count. By giving it 6 rotation segments, it's essentially turned it into a hexagonal shape, so it isn't very cylindrical anymore. The thing is, it's only going to be used as a graphic element. It is going to be very small, and I'd much rather have the scene optimized to work better. If we keep it at 36 segments and have hundreds and hundreds of these, then we're going to run into RAM limitations. So it's a good idea to think about these kind of optimizations as you build a scene. One other thing I'm just going to adjust on the cylinder. If we deselect, you'll notice that the thong shading has given us a kind of soft edge where it's trying to round off these angles. We can adjust that so that we get a nice sharp edge there by clicking on the thong tag and just reducing the angle down. So if we just take this down to, there we go, say 58, I'm just going to take it to 55. You can see that the hexagonal shape becomes clearly defined. This just makes it look a little bit cleaner, and you don't get those kind of shading artifacts that can sometimes appear. Okay, so now we have our cylinder, we have our sphere to clone onto. The next thing we need to do is to add in a cloner object so that we can clone this cylinder over the sphere surface. I'm just going to deselect the sphere for a moment and disable it. Select the cylinder, and with the cylinder selected, if we hold down the Alt key and choose the cloner object, what will happen is the selected object will become a child of the cloner. So in this case that's our cylinder, and to clone an object it does need to be a child. If we just zoom out, we can see that the cloner object's working and we have 3 cloned cylinders. So one thing I think is a good idea is to save regularly. I've already saved the scene. I'm going to use the save incremental choice and save it again at this point. And you will find that I'll probably be saving very frequently, and I'll pretty much always use the save incremental, because then if I make a mistake I can always go back to a previous state in the model and work it from there again. Okay, so let's come back to the scene in hand. Here we have our cloner. Let's just pull the attributes for the cloner up slightly and move this over so we can see everything quite clearly. First thing, let's rename it to cloner globe. And if we come down to the settings here, you can see that currently it's set to mode linear with a count of 3. So we have 3 cylinders that are cloned and repeated on Y. What we need to do is we need to change the mode to object, because we wish to clone onto an object. When we do that, you can see that the interface actually changes. We now have a field here which we can drag our object into. You don't always have to drag an object into here. One thing you can do is you can make the cloner a child of the object that you wish to clone onto. So let's first of all just select our sphere, enable it, press O on the keyboard so we can frame this, and let's drag our cloner so it's a child of this object. Once you have an object in this field, or you have an object as a parent, you're given a few more options. First of all, we have up vector. This is a way of making our objects always point in a certain direction. I'm just going to switch that to off. We then have the option of mode, and this is how we'd like to clone onto our object. If we select the sphere, you can see that it's made up of polygons, although it's actually parametric, virtual polygons with edges and also vertices. So here we have the option to clone onto the vertex, which is the default, and you can see each cylinder is placed where there is a point. We could also clone onto the edge, and we can also clone onto the polygon center, or we can clone on the surface. When we clone on the surface, increase the count, and you can see it randomly creates the clone over the surface. The final option is the volume. If we hide our sphere and show the cloner, you can see that now all our cylinders are actually in the volume of that object. I'm not 100% sure that volume is available in earlier releases, but for this class that doesn't matter because we're actually going to use vertex. I want to see the sphere, so I'm going to unhide that again. Let's zoom in a little bit closer so we can see what's going on in some more detail. As you can see, the cylinder is currently lying flat on the surface. We can change that, and the way we can change that is by changing the orientation of the cylinder. So if we select that, come into the Attributes Manager and adjust the orientation. If we set that to +Z, then now our cylinders, point outwards. Okay, to create our globe, we certainly don't have enough of these cylinders. So what we need to do is we need to increase the number of vertices on our sphere. As we've cloned onto the vertex, this determines the number of clones that are generated. This is why we don't get a count option. So if we select our sphere, we can see that we have 24 segments. So let's change this to say 48. You can see the number of polygons increases, as does the number of vertices, and if we deselect, you can see as does the number of clones. I think that the number of clones needs to be much higher than this. So what I'm going to do is select the sphere again, come into the segments, and in here I'm just going to put times 4. You can do this in most of the fields in Cinema 4D. It's quite a handy little tip. You can perform quite complicated calculations within the field, and when you press enter, it will then work that out for you. So now we have 192 segments. You could see that it took a moment or two for it to draw that. Let's just hit render. Okay, and now it's calculating. It shouldn't take too long, but you can see that we have quite a lot of cylinders created in the scene. If we'd have left these at 36 segments on rotation each, then you can imagine the amount of polygons we had would be coming up into the hundreds of thousands already, and this is just the first object that we're making. I don't actually think 192 segments is going to be high enough, but just for a moment I'm going to just put divided by 2 just to reduce that down so we can see what we're doing and we get our results a little bit quicker. Once we've set this up, I'll show you a way that we can optimize the scene so that it has a reduced number of clones while we're working, and then we can change that at render time for the full quality. Now the reason I reduced it down was just to show you another option here, and if you notice that the way that the clones are distributed over the sphere is based on where the vertices are. So at the moment they're quite spread out here, but if we come to the top, they become quite bunched up. Now this really depends on the kind of look that you're after, of how you could approach this to change this. But with this object, for instance, the sphere, we get the option to change the type of sphere. So if we come in here, you can see that we have a few different options. Let's just disable our cloner and cylinder for a moment. We have tetrahedron, hexahedron, octahedron, etc., etc. Isocosahedron is quite a good option. This has a fairly even distribution over the whole surface. You can see that there's very little bunching. You get these kind of points here, but other than that, the segments remain pretty much even. So if we switch our cloner and cylinder on now and render, you can see that the result is quite different looking. We now have a much more even distribution of clones over the surface of our sphere. So I'll leave that up to you how you set that. For this class, I'm going to leave it on standard. There's no particular reason for that. I just think that for the globe, the result looks better like this. That's a matter of opinion, and maybe you might like to choose icosahedron. That was the other option that I was thinking about using. In the end, I decided on using the standard sphere. Now we've got the cloner set up with the cylinders cloned across the surface of our sphere. I want to add in a globe material so that I can then use the shader effector to kind of hide and show the cylinders and hopefully reveal a kind of globe look. So to do that, as I say, I'm going to use a shader effector, and the shader effector works with materials. So the first thing I need to do is create a new material. You can do that just by double clicking in the material manager. And let's just rename this globe. So now we have a material created and selected. We can see all the properties here in the attributes manager. So what we need to do for this example is to load a picture of the Earth. We have supplied one to you. This should be in the 3D text folder in the download. I'd suggest copying that to your hard drive in a suitable place. Once you've done that, you can click on the little button here with the 3 dots, locate the file, and then click open. That will then load that JPEG into the selected color channel. We can see that in the preview here. We can actually right click and we can rotate this around so we can see our material from lots of different angles. If we get lost there, we can right click and go to the bottom and select reset rotation. It's just off the bottom of the capture area here. For this example, I'm going to right click here and choose plain as my preview because I'd like to see this as a flat preview. I don't need to see any shading, I just want to clearly see what the image is. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to use this material with our cloner object, and to use materials with the cloner we use what's called the shader effector. Now effectors come with MoGraph, and basically what they do is they affect parameters of the cloner. And they also affect several other objects. They can affect the position, scale, rotation and other properties. The best way to explain this is to see it in action. So if we select the cloner, you can see in the tab we have an effectors list. At the moment there is nothing in there. If we had any effectors in our scene, we could then drag them into this list. We can also reorder them in this list because the order of execution of the effectors is also quite important. If we have the cloner selected, when we add an effector, it will automatically add it in this list. So let's just go ahead and do that first of all. So we come to the MoGraph list, come down, choose shader effector. If we select the cloner again, you can see that the shader effector has been added to the effectors list. If we select the shader effector, you can see that now we have a whole new set of parameters. As with most objects, along the top of the Attributes Manager we have a series of tabs. Now we will go through a lot of these settings for the different effectors throughout the tutorial, so we won't cover them all at once. I'm just going to pull that up so we can see more clearly. First of all, we have the Basic tab, which is the same as all objects. We then have a Coordinates tab, which tells us whereabouts in space our object is, the scale and the rotation for it. We then have an Effector tab. This tells us the strength of our effector. I'm not sure if you noticed, but this has already had an effect on our cylinders. If I hit render, you can see that now they look whiter and they are in fact slightly larger. If I disable the shader effector and render it again, you can see that there is a difference. They go back to being grayer. So the effector strength controls how strong the effector is. Here you can see I've increased it well high, well over 1,000. If we render now, you can see that our cylinders have scaled up hugely and they are bright white. Underneath the strength parameter we have a selection parameter. Now depending on which version of Cinema 4D you are using, depends on whether you see this selection slot. This is for dragging in MoGraph selections. We won't actually be using those in this tutorial, so that's not relevant. The next parameter, or the next tab should I say, is the parameter tab. Now this is pretty important. This determines which parameters the shader effector is actually affecting. At the moment you can see that we have scale checked, position and rotation are unchecked. If we check position, let's put in 500 on Y, and you can see that all of the cylinders move out 500 on Y. This is Y on the local axis. I'm just going to reset that back to 0 and uncheck position. One thing you will notice is that this is affecting all of the clones. So what kind of use is that at the moment? How do we use it with our globe material? Well, what we need to do is we need to specify in the shader effector which material we'd like to use. And where we do that is in the shading tab. So if we switch to the shading tab, you can see here we have the option to choose a channel custom shader. We can then click here to add in a shader. And we can use any of the shaders that are built into Cinema 4D or any third-party plugins that you may have. We can also choose to load any bitmaps that we may have. So we could load our earth.jpg directly here. Very often what you'll want to do is you'll want to use a material that you already have that's existing on another object. If I take my globe material, drag it onto my sphere, you can see that that now applies the globe texture, and it uses a spherical wrap, which is the default on a sphere, because that is how the UVs are mapped. This is perfect for what we want. The reason you would use a texture tab rather than choosing directly in here to use the bitmap is because you can then specify the type of projection that you'd like to use. So you could choose flat, for instance. You could choose frontal. For our example, we want spherical, or in this case UVW, as we're using a sphere. So on the shader effector in the shading tab, what we need to do is we need to specify a channel. If you come back to our material, you'll notice that we loaded our image into the color channel. We could have loaded that into any of the other channels here, which will accept an input. We chose the color channel. So on the shader effector, we choose color as the channel we'd like to use. The interface then changes and we come up with a slot to add a texture tag. So guess what we do now? We take our texture tag here and we drag it into this slot. Okay. At the moment it's quite difficult to see what's happening on our sphere. We could take our tag and remove it from the shader effector. For instance, we could add a null and we could just drag it onto there. You can almost see the effect that the shader effector is having. Let's hit render. And you can see that we have a difference in size and a difference in color based on our world map. The thing with moving this tag onto the null object is that if we move our sphere or we move our null, then the mapping space might well change. So we really want to keep that texture tag linked with the object. So if we just drag it back to our object, we're faced with the same problem, that the texture is going to render. So for now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a dummy texture. So I'm just going to double click and create a plain material, drag that onto the sphere, and that then overrides the material that's already there. So if we hit render, you can then see our globe material is kind of taking effect. Let's just zoom in so we can see it a little bit more clearly. And as you can see, what's happened is in certain places our cylinders have scaled up. So let's come back to the shader effector. Now we have the texture that we're using and adjust some of the parameters. What I'd like to do is just show you how, if we select position and select Y 500 as before, now you can see that it's only moved out in certain places, and where our land masses are, you can just see it under here. None of the cylinders have moved. Well, we don't want to move them in Y. In fact, we don't want to move them at all. What we want to do is essentially make them visible where the C is. So to do that, we can scale them down. If you're not sure how you need to adjust things, then the best thing to do is use a little bit of trial and error. At the moment, scale is active. Let's set the scale to 2. Okay, so we can see what's happened now is all these cylinders that are in the places where we have ocean have scaled up, and they have essentially scaled up to twice their scale. So we want the opposite of that. We want to scale them down. So let's set this to -1. There we go. So what that's done is that scaled them down once their whole size, which essentially scales them down to nothing. So now, where we have black, the shader effector has no effect. Where we have white, it scales our cylinders down. So what we've basically created is a very simple version of our globe. If we select our sphere, let's increase the count to double, 192. Let's hit render, and you can see that we now have the globe texture being reflected in the scale of the spheres. So let's select our shader effector and let's call this globe scale. As you add more effectors later, it'd be handy to know what each one does. I'm also going to just move it to the very bottom of the object manager so it's executed at the end after the cloner. For this example, it isn't that important, but the order of execution can be important for certain things, so it's quite a good idea to think about that too. So now we've got this far, I'm just going to use the incremental save and save the project once again. It's not that easy to see the results at the moment, so just to make it easier, what we can do is we can add a material to our cylinder. So I'm just going to double click to create another new material. Let's call this cylinder, and for the moment I'm just going to select, say, a red colour. This is just a dummy colour for now, and if we hit render you can see the result a lot more clearly. One thing that you might notice, if we just rotate this around, the scene is getting rather slow already. We've got a lot of cylinders cloned onto this sphere, and what happens is the cloner essentially creates a cylinder at every vertex, and then the shader effector scales some of them down. Towards the top we've got quite a lot of bunching. Around the centre of the globe it's not too bad, but on the top of our sphere you can see we've got quite a bit of bunching, and I don't think that the number of cylinders on here is high enough. I think that it should be higher so that the land masses are more clearly defined. So this is going to slow the scene down even more. First of all, we need to look at a way of reducing this bunching towards the top, and the other thing that we need to do is look at how we can increase the count of cylinders that are cloned across the sphere but not slow the whole scene down. If we carry on working like it is now, I mean, we're not going to get very far. It's going to be a real pain to do any animation. We're going to have to keep rendering because we won't be able to get redraw, and it just generally will slow the whole process down. If you're working against a tight deadline, then that's just no use whatsoever. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to address the bunching, and then we'll come back to the kind of speeding up of the scene. What we can do to address the bunching is we could essentially scale the cylinders that are towards the top and the bottom of the globe. We could scale them down. Alternatively, we could select the sphere and we could select a different sphere type. We could use the icosahedron. That would distribute the cylinders more evenly over the whole surface and we wouldn't get that problem. However, I thought I'd leave it this way so I could show you a method of scaling the cylinders down towards the top and the bottom. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use another effector. Just to speed things up for now, I'm going to select my clone. I'm just going to divide by 2 and set that back to 96, just so that we kind of have it at a more workable speed. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch off the scale effector, the shader effector, sorry, so we can see all of our cylinders. You can still see the bunching quite clearly even from this far away. These cylinders here are spread out quite a lot. These at the top are bunched up. So let's select our cloner and let's add in another effector. For this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the plane effector. Now the plane effector isn't available in some of the earlier releases of Cinema 4D, so there's two options there. You can use the shader effector with nothing in it, or you can use the formula effector with, I think you put 1 as the formula. I always used the shader effector with nothing in it. The plane effector is there just because all it does is uses the effector properties to adjust the parameters. It doesn't have any other uses, but even that in itself can be very, very useful. By default, it has the Y position set to 100, and you can see that it's performing a very similar function to the shader effector when the shader effector didn't have a texture in it. So we want to actually use this to scale our cylinders down. So let's deselect position and let's enable scale. What I essentially want to do is scale down the size of the cylinders towards the top and the bottom of the sphere. By scaling them down, they won't become so bunched and they'll get small gaps between them, and hopefully it won't look quite so bad. In fact, hopefully it will look quite good. And you'll find this quite useful for several other objects if you have polygons that are quite dense in certain places. So I've just moved in so we can see the area around the top more clearly. So with the plane effector, let's just rename this globe scale, and first of all we could check uniform scale, and let's set -1. So what that's done is that's scaled all the cylinders down so that we can't actually see them. If we increase that amount, you can see they gradually scale up. The problem at the moment is that it's affecting all of our cylinders. As I reduce this value down, all the cylinders are affected. Now we don't want to affect these cylinders that are right in the very middle of our sphere. So how can we use an effector on an object but restrict the area which it's affecting? What we can do is we can use what's called fall off. So along the top of the tabs for all of your effectors you have one which is called fall off. So let's just switch to there for now, and at the moment you can see that the shape is set to infinite. If we click here we have quite a few options. The option that I'm going to use is sphere. So now you can see that the plane effector is having no effect whatsoever. I'm scrubbing through the parameter and none of the cylinders are scaling up or down. Let's just set this to -1 so we can see that hopefully when we move the effector fall off into an area where the cylinders are, we should see this effect. So let's just grab our plane effector and pull it to the outside of our shape. If we move around so that we can see this object, you can see that what's happened is we have a sphere shape first of all. This is the fall off, it's set to sphere. If we choose box, you can see it changes to a box shape. Any of the cylinders that are inside this sphere area get affected by the fall off. As we move this around, you can see that the cylinders within that shape are scaled down. So this is pretty cool, and we can use this for some quite cool effects and techniques, and we'll go through a few of those later on. The other option you have here is invert. If we invert that, then only the cylinders that are inside the fall off shape will be visible, because we've got our parameter scale set to -1. So what the effector is doing is scaling all the objects down. By inversing the fall off, it means that everything outside of that fall off will be scaled down. So this is the option that we want, and what we need to do is we need to set this fall off so that it occurs around the shape of our sphere, so that the cylinders towards the center aren't affected, but the cylinders at the top and the bottom are affected. So let's just reset the coordinates for our plane effector so it's back in the very center. And what we can do now is we can adjust the fall off. As you can see, we've got these orange handles. We can grab these, and if we hold shift it will scale our fall off, and now you can see the fall off is occurring as everything's inside the red part. We don't have any effect. So now what we really need to do is we need to bring the top and the bottom in so that it only affects the clones in this top and bottom area. If we switch to the fall off tab, you can see that the values here have changed. Okay, obviously didn't hold shift down straight away because they're not quite the same. Now we've got this size roughly how we want. I'm going to actually come in here and adjust them numerically. What we need to do is we need to adjust the Y height, so we have X, Y and Z. I'm going to round these numbers up so they're even, so I'm just going to use 1000 for my X and Z. You can see that's already kind of stretching it out, and we just need to lower the value for Y, so let's set something like 400. Okay, and you can see that that's now having an effect. Hit render, and you can see that our clones towards the top and the bottom are now pretty much invisible. Let's just select the sphere, press O to frame the active object, and we could go in a little bit closer than that. And hit render again. Now one thing that you'll notice is the plane effector is scaling all the axes of the cylinder, X, Y and Z. Well, it'd be quite a good idea if it didn't scale the length of it. So if we come to our plane effector and come to the parameters, here we have scale. At the moment we have uniform scale checked. Let's just uncheck that. And what we can do is we can set -1 for X and -1 for Y, so it doesn't scale them on Z. And here you can now see that we have our cylinders showing up towards the top. They're still getting pretty small, but hopefully once we have it nice and dense and we have our globe shader effector switched back on, this should look a lot neater. We won't get the same kind of dense patterns at the top, and everything should look pretty much cooler. So let's try that out, shall we? Let's switch to our clone, our sphere, and I'm going to put a very high amount here, 96 times 4. So we've got 384 segments. This is going to be a huge number of clones. Let's switch our shader effector on, and now we may have to wait a moment or two for this to refresh. And there we go, and now you can see that is looking pretty dense, so I'm going to render this. There we go, it's now rendered, and you can see at the bottom here in the status bar that it took 29 seconds to calculate that. So this is the kind of result that we're after. It's looking pretty cool. As I said before, working with this scene is now going to become terribly slow. So we've essentially finished the first class of this tutorial, and we're going to move on to the next one. In there, the first thing that we'll do is we'll optimize this down. Once we've done that, we'll add the orbiting text, and for that we'll be looking at importing some Illustrator artwork, creating extrude NURBS, and then we'll be using MoGraph to take the extrude NURBS objects and kind of wrapping them around the sphere. So thanks for watching that. Hope you've enjoyed the first part of the tutorial, and let's move on.